Leviathan Wakes is the first novel in the enormous 9-book-long space opera science fiction epic, written by James S.A. Corey, who is actually secretly, but not so secretly, two people. This enormous series has also been adapted to TV, and I promised myself I wouldn't watch any of the show until I'd read at least something of the series, which is exactly what I did with Game of Thrones, and I feel like it paid off. I tried to go book season, book season, book season. I won't be doing that with this. I read the first one and I feel like I'm done because this book has a lot of highs and lows, pros and cons, peaks and valleys, good and bad, blah blah blah. They all mean the same thing, and there's a lot of different ways to say that. I don't know why, but variety is the spice of life. First, what's it about? Leviathan Wakes, the Expanse series, is set several hundred years into humanity's future, where we have colonized most of our solar system. Earth and Mars are the superpowers of the solar system. But there are also millions upon millions of people living on the moons of Jupiter and Saturn and within the asteroid belt. But the people who live there are, for the most part, proletariat. They live difficult lives. There are mining colonies, lots of transport ships. There's a prominent criminal underground. Things are not equal. This is certainly not Star Trek's version of humanity's future. This is a bleak capitalist future. It kind of feels like Elon Musk's future. And we have two protagonists, Holden and Miller. When the novel begins, Holden is the XO of a transport ship, taking water from moons like Europa to space stations in the asteroid belt where people need water. The ship that he's on, the Canterbury, responds to a distress signal. And what happens here is kind of a big moment, but it happens very, very early on, and if I don't talk about it, I'll have nothing to say. So, tiny little spoiler for something that happens early in the book. It feels like a really big deal, but it is the setup for the story. The Canterbury has a decent-sized crew, and they send a shuttle of just 5 people, including Holden, the XO of the ship, to this derelict craft that has a signal going off. But when they find the signal, it's being sent out by some kind of a box that has a Martian stamp on it. And then suddenly, the Canterbury, which is floating off into space, is blown up by a nuke. Finding that box triggered an attack, and the whole Canterbury is suddenly gone. Holden is now the captain, but he's only captain of 4 other people. And then he sends out a video stream to everyone on the belt, saying that his ship was just destroyed, and he's holding a signal with Mars's stamp on it, heavily implying that members of the belt were just attacked and killed by a nuclear warhead sent by Mars. An implication of an act of war. Our other protagonist is Miller, and Miller is a very stereotypical noir detective, a guy who is gritty and he drinks too much and he sees everything in shades of grey. He's an edgy noir detective. It's kind of cliched. And that's my first negative of this book, is Miller as a character. He is a tired, very old stereotype of a noir detective. If it was a funny cliche that got leaned on a little bit, it might be fun in a tongue-in-cheek kind of a way, but it's not. It's deadly serious and kind of laughable for that. Miller has been tasked with finding the daughter of a rich family, and the prologue reveals that that daughter was on the ship that sent out the distress signal to Holden. When you read the prologue, you find out something awful is happening on this ship. The crew are now gone, including this girl, and Miller needs to find her. And so off he goes. The chapters are really, really nicely structured, roughly 10 pages each, and so there is a constant, consistent pace, and that is one of the very big positives of this book, is a consistent pace. The second half of the novel is definitely more exciting than the first half, but I can forgive the first half of being a bit slower because there's so much world building to be done. And character writing, although that's a negative because the characters are very two-dimensional. There is nothing to these people, especially Miller. But the pace is consistent, and I really like that. 10 pages-ish per chapter, and you just go and go and go, and each chapter moves back and forth like a pendulum between Holden and Miller all the time. So it has this fantastic rhythm to it that I really, really admired. 10 pages, Holden Miller, Holden Miller, Holden Miller. It's really, really nice. But when Holden and Miller aren't particularly interesting characters, that rhythm loses its appeal. Something I immediately loved about Leviathan Wakes is how realistic it feels, how possible this whole future feels. Everything you see in this book feels entirely plausible, and you could imagine this being humanity's future 500 or whatever years from now. But the downside to that is that it is not a hopeful future. It is a future where capitalism reigns supreme, and not only that, but we're still doing the same geopolitical struggles that we were doing on Earth between nations. And that's on purpose, because science fiction and fantasy books so often reflect real-world struggles, real-world political issues. The dynamics between Earth, Mars, and the Belt are very, very familiar. They are parallels to things that have happened and are currently happening in the real world. Depending on where you're from, you will read this book and you will see the antagonism and the framing of warfare and the geopolitical tensions between Earth, Mars, and the asteroid belt as something familiar to you, to your country, to your country's history, to your culture. It might be connected to colonialism, it might be connected to border disputes. And a great example of that is the Outer Planets Alliance, the OPA, who are a very strong parallel to many small upstart groups that have existed and currently exist all around the world across multiple nations. A prominent example for me as a British person was the IRA. The Outer Planets Alliance, depending on how you look at them, how you frame them, are freedom fighters, are a proletariat uprising rebellion waiting to happen, or are they organized criminals, even terrorists? Depends on how you look at them. The Outer Planets Alliance are a tale as old as time, and there is good and bad to these parallels. It's smart. It is reflective of so much that we've seen and we continue to see across the world. But it's also tired and boring, and it makes you think, great, we have nothing to look forward to in humanity's future. Capitalism will continue to separate the rich and the poor and punish the proletariat for being the working man, and people will continue to rise up out of struggle and commit acts of terror out of necessity because they want to break free. The cycle just continues, and that's disappointing because it feels partly unimaginative and partly just very bleak and negative. But as I said, the positive of that is that it is all very well explored, and it's fun to think about the parallels between oppressed working class people, oppressed nations, oppressed cultures, religions, etc., and the powerful of Earth and Mars who lord over them, who throw them a bit of money, who throw them unfair contracts, who put them in unfair, almost inhospitable conditions. And again, so many stories have explored this. The first thing that comes to mind is the book/film/TV show Snowpiercer. Very, very similar setup. Books that explore class divides and unfair social dynamics. It's smart, it's satisfying, but it's also kind of predictable and unimaginative, and it's not a future that I like to envision. But the really big negative for me with this book is, as I said, the character writing. It's not just bland, it's weird. And you can tell that this book was written by two cishet white men. Because you see, very, very suddenly, a little ways into the book, Miller starts becoming obsessed with this girl that he's been asked to find. Miller himself is a middle-aged guy who drinks too much. The girl he's hoping to find has got to be in her late teens or early 20s, because she has run away from her rich family and is rebelling and joined the Outer Planets Alliance. He has a photo of her and a bit of information about her, and at one point in the novel, he confesses to himself that he's in love with her. In love with what? And how? And ew. That's gross. He has become obsessed with the idea of this teenage girl that he needs to find, and it is not framed as a bad or weird thing. It's supposed to be romantic or interesting or add some kind of dynamic to his character, but what the fuck? It's never explained, it's really gross, and I don't like it. What is the point of it? He just falls in love with his case, a girl half his age, and all he knows about her is her name, a photo, and a description by her rich parents and his boss? What? Like, oh my god, that's gross. Tell me this book was written by two cishet white men without telling me. Ugh. I had someone in my comments tell me that I have to watch The Expanse because it's a wonderful example of a future of equality between genders and sexualities and races and classes and religions and cultures and blah blah blah. A world of equality, a world of feminism and queer rights and blah blah blah. The book is certainly not that at all. This is a book by two men who maybe could get like a participation trophy for trying to show some kind of inclusion thing here by depicting a world where it seems like women can be as powerful and as in charge of things as men. That's the biggest compliment I could give these two cishet white men for thinking about people who aren't cishet white men, and it's not really a compliment. I am deftly disappointed by so much of the representation and the cultural exploration that is going on here in this enormous, oversized, future sci-fi space opera. It's just men being gross. Or at least men not having changed and grown and developed. It's still patriarchy. It's still male perspectives over and over again. It's still women being shelved. It still has an enormous lack of representation for various cultures. But to kind of get around that, they have created their own culture, which is another pro. This is another high point of the book, is that the Belters hate Earth and Mars, and because they live out there on the asteroid belt where gravity is different, everyone's really, really tall and thin. Everyone's kind of lanky and... I'm just gonna do that. And the people there have also developed a very distinct language/dialect, somewhere between the two. Kind of like Scots. It is a language, but it's also recognizable. And it's fun. It's fun to explore that. It's a wonderful, interesting culture. It feels fleshed out enough to make you believe in it. And it's also reminiscent again of cultures that have been oppressed. I mentioned Scots before. The Scots language and dialect separates the oppressed Scots from the oppressive English. This is kind of a similar thing. And I really, really enjoyed that. I thought it was great. But it's certainly a way of sidestepping having to do any actual exploration of diversity and inclusivity, because this is humanity's future. These are not alien races that are being created by these writers. And humanity's future is still going to have diversity in it amongst races and classes and genders and sexual orientations. But none of that is explored. Instead, you've just got this underclass of belters. So class divides are really well explored, but no other kinds of divides. Again, this is a high point and a low point all at once. There's a lot of good and bad in this book. The world building is fantastic and very, very satisfying, but it also feels predictable, kind of two-dimensional, kind of weightless sometimes. And also people call it a space opera because it's a massive book in a massive series of massive books set in space. But is that enough to call it a space opera? Because at least this first book is very much about humanity's future in our solar system, creating analogies and metaphors and parallels to real-world geopolitical struggles and class divides. So it's all very recognizable. I can't spoil anything, but in the second half, as I said, things get more exciting, and there are twists and turns that do lead towards the space opera. So I'm sure if I kept reading the series, the space opera sense would increase and grow in a really exciting way. But I'm not going to do that because I don't feel invested in any way in anything. Not the people, not the story, and not the world. All of that said, and that is all very negative, it's still very impressively well put together, well paced. It's kind of an okay book. There is a lot of squandered potential here, and again, maybe things get way better as it goes. I'm gonna switch to the series, I'm gonna watch the show, and see what the show does. Instead of reading 8 more 600 plus page novels, I'll watch the show. Let's see what that does. Maybe it handles some representation better. Maybe the characters are more fleshed out and not awkward, sexist stereotypes. Because there's so much potential here. This has been so well plotted out and explored, and it all feels very plausible and real and exciting in some ways. But then it's also flat and predictable. It sits somewhere between hopeful and interesting and exciting and bland and unimaginative and uninspired. It's weird how they manage to do both of these things and sit between them. It's frustrating. There are a lot of highs and lows, peaks and valleys, pros and cons to Leviathan Wakes. So, as I said, I'm gonna go watch The Expanse and see what I make of that instead. The book is fine, it could be a lot better, but it certainly could have been worse. It'll do. It's two cishet white men writing about the future. A capitalist future of tired class divide metaphors. It's fine. Subscribe for books.